Sarah Martinez had always been drawn to quiet places. The small coastal town of Millfield offered exactly what she needed after years of working as an emergency room nurse in busy city hospitals. Here she could hear the ocean waves instead of sirens, see stars instead of fluorescent lights, and finally breathe without the constant weight of life and death decisions pressing on her shoulders. She had bought the small cottage on Beacon Street 6 months ago, using every penny of her savings. The house needed work, but it sat perfectly between the town center and the rocky coastline, giving her the best of both worlds. Most mornings she would walk down to Murphy's Diner for coffee, and then spend her afternoons fixing whatever had broken during the night. The roof leaked when it rained, the front steps creaked dangerously, and the heating system made sounds like an angry dragon, but it was hers. The townspeople had welcomed her with the careful friendliness that small communities show to newcomers. Mrs. Patterson from next door brought her homemade cookies every Tuesday. Joe Murphy always had her coffee ready before she even ordered it. The local handyman, Pete, charged her half his normal rate because he said the town needed more young people willing to fix up the old places. Sarah worked part-time at the small medical clinic in town, handling everything from scraped knees to heart attacks. Dr. Williams, who had been running the clinic for 30 years, was grateful to have someone with her experience. Most days were quiet, treating tourists with sunburns or locals with farming injuries. But Sarah found peace in the simple routine. She had come to Millfield to escape memories that followed her everywhere in the city. Too many patients lost, too many families she had to comfort, too many nights when she went home covered in other people's blood. The small town offered her a chance to heal people without the constant pressure of trauma surgery and emergency medicine. On Tuesday evening, Sarah decided to take her usual walk along the coastal path. The weather had been strange all day, with dark clouds gathering over the ocean and wind that seemed to change direction every few minutes. Local fishermen had stayed in port, saying something felt wrong about the water. Sarah had noticed more Coast Guard boats than usual patrolling the shoreline, but she figured it was just routine training exercises. The path wound along the cliffs for about 3 miles, offering stunning views of the rocky coastline and the lighthouse that had guided ships safely to harbor for over a century. Sarah loved this walk because it reminded her why she had chosen this place. The sound of waves crashing against rocks below and the smell of salt air always cleared her mind. As she rounded the bend near Eagle Point, she noticed something unusual. A small inflatable boat had washed up against the rocks in a hidden cove below. It looked military, painted in dark colors that would be hard to spot from a distance. Sarah stopped and pulled out her phone to call the Coast Guard, but realized she had no signal this far from town. She debated whether to continue her walk or head back to report what she had seen. The boat could have been abandoned for days, or it could be evidence of something more serious. Her nursing instincts told her to investigate, but her common sense warned her to stay away from situations that might be dangerous. Before she could decide, she heard voices coming from the direction of the boat. 2 men were talking in low, urgent tones, and they didn't sound like local fishermen or Coast Guard personnel. One voice had an accent she couldn't identify, and the other spoke with the clipped, professional tone of someone used to giving orders. Sarah crouched behind a large boulder and tried to see what was happening below. The men were dressed in dark clothing and seemed to be unloading equipment from the boat. They moved with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before, and something about their behavior made her nervous. She was about to leave when she heard footsteps behind her on the path. A man approached wearing civilian clothes but moving with the alertness of someone trained for combat. He was tall, with dark hair and eyes that constantly scanned the area around him. When he saw Sarah hiding behind the boulder, he immediately dropped to the ground and motioned for her to stay quiet. "Military?" she whispered, hoping he was one of the good guys. He nodded and showed her a badge that identified him as Petty Officer Marcus Chen, U.S. Navy. "Ma'am, I need you to leave this area immediately. It's not safe." Sarah looked down at the men by the boat, then back at Marcus. "Are they the reason you're here?" "Yes, and they're more dangerous than they look. Please go back to town and call the local police. Tell them to contact the Coast Guard station and report suspicious activity at Eagle Point." Sarah started to move away, but something in Marcus's voice made her pause. He sounded like someone who was facing a difficult situation alone, and her nursing instincts kicked in. "How many of them are there?" "More than I can handle by myself." My team is 20 minutes out, but these guys aren't going to wait around that long. Marcus checked his weapon and looked down at the cove. Ma'am, please. The best way you can help is to get the authorities here as quickly as possible. Sarah nodded and started back down the path, but she couldn't shake the feeling that 20 minutes might be too long. She had seen that look in Marcus's eyes before, in the emergency room when doctors knew they were fighting against time they didn't have. As she hurried toward town, she heard the first sounds of conflict behind her and knew that whatever was happening at Eagle Point was about to become much more serious. Sarah had made it halfway back to town when she heard the gunshot echo across the water. The sound stopped her in her tracks, and every instinct she had developed as an emergency nurse told her to turn around. She knew Marcus was alone, outnumbered, and possibly injured. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone, but the screen still showed no signal. She stood on the path for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, torn between following Marcus's instructions and doing what her heart told her was right. Another shot rang out, followed by shouting voices, and Sarah made her decision. She turned around and ran back toward Eagle Point. When she reached the boulder where she had hidden earlier, the scene below had changed dramatically. Marcus was pinned down behind a large rock near the water's edge, while 3 men with assault rifles had positioned themselves around the cove. They were clearly professionals, moving with coordinated precision as they tried to flush him out of his hiding spot. Sarah could see that Marcus was bleeding from his left shoulder, and his ammunition was running low. He would fire a few rounds to keep the attackers back, then duck down to reload. But each time he exposed himself, the gunfire intensified. It was only a matter of time before they overwhelmed his position. She noticed a steep trail that led down the cliff face to a position above Marcus's hiding spot. It was dangerous and would put her directly in the line of fire, but it might be the only way to help him. Sarah had never fired a gun in her life, but she had spent years making split-second decisions under pressure, and she knew how to assess risks. Moving as quietly as possible, Sarah started down the narrow trail. The rocks were loose and slippery from the ocean spray, and one wrong step would send her tumbling into the cove below. She could hear the gunfight continuing as she climbed, and the sound of bullets ricocheting off rocks made her stomach clench with fear. Halfway down the trail, she found what she was looking for. A pile of large rocks had created a natural shelter about 20 feet above Marcus's position. From there, she would have a clear view of the entire cove and might be able to create enough distraction to give him a chance to escape. Sarah gathered several head-sized stones and positioned herself behind the largest boulder. She waited until one of the attackers moved into the open, then hurled a rock as hard as she could toward the opposite side of the cove. The stone crashed into the water with a loud splash, causing all 3 men to turn their weapons toward the sound. In that moment of confusion, Marcus was able to change positions and find better cover behind a cluster of rocks closer to the cliff face. Sarah threw another rock, this time aiming for one of the men's positions. The stone struck the rocks near his feet, sending chips of granite flying and forcing him to duck for cover. "Who's up there?" one of the attackers shouted in heavily accented English. Sarah realized she had bought Marcus some time, but now she had drawn their attention to herself. She needed to keep them distracted long enough for his backup to arrive, but she was running out of rocks large enough to make an impact. That's when she noticed the old wooden crate half buried in the sand near her position. Inside, she found rusty fishing weights and several emergency flares that had probably been left by fishermen years ago. Sarah had never used a flare gun before, but the instructions were simple enough. She loaded the first flare and aimed it toward the boat, hoping to create enough light and smoke to confuse the attackers. The flare struck the water near the vessel and exploded in a brilliant red shower of sparks. The sudden brightness temporarily blinded everyone in the cove, and Sarah used the confusion to fire a second flare directly at the rocks where 2 of the men were hiding. The second flare hit the rocks and bounced toward the attackers, forcing them to scramble for new positions. In the chaos, Marcus was able to move again, this time reaching a position where he could see both his enemies and the trail where Sarah was hidden. "Get out of here," he shouted up at her. But Sarah was already loading her third and final flare. One of the attackers had figured out where the flares were coming from and was trying to climb the cliff face toward Sarah's position. She could see him moving from rock to rock, his rifle slung across his back as he used both hands to climb. He was about 10 feet below her and climbing fast. Sarah aimed the flare gun directly at the climbing man and fired. The flare struck him in the chest and the burning phosphorus ignited his clothing. He screamed and lost his grip on the rocks, falling 20 feet into the shallow water below. The sound he made when he hit the rocks was something Sarah knew she would never forget. The remaining two attackers immediately focused their fire on Sarah's position. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around her, sending stone fragments flying through the air. One sharp piece of granite sliced across her forehead, and she felt warm blood running down her face. Another bullet struck the boulder directly in front of her, showering her with rock dust and debris. Sarah pressed herself as flat as possible against the rocks, but she knew her position was compromised. The attackers had a clear line of sight to her hiding spot, and she had no more flares to use as weapons. She could hear them coordinating their approach, planning to attack her position from two different angles. That's when Marcus made his move. Using the distraction Sarah had created, he was able to flank the remaining attackers. The sound of his automatic weapon filled the cove as he engaged both men simultaneously. The firefight lasted less than 30 seconds, but to Sarah, it felt like hours. When the shooting stopped, the sudden silence was almost deafening. Sarah could hear nothing but the sound of waves against rocks and her own rapid breathing. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold on to the empty flare gun. "Sarah," Marcus called from below. "Are you hit?" She tried to answer, but her voice wouldn't work. The adrenaline that had carried her through the fight was wearing off, and she was beginning to understand exactly how much danger she had been in. Her legs felt like water, and the cut on her forehead was bleeding more heavily than she had realized. "I'm coming up," Marcus said, and Sarah could hear him starting to climb the trail. She wanted to tell him she was fine, that he should check on his own wounds first, but the words wouldn't come. The reality of what had just happened was hitting her like a truck. She had just helped kill 3 people. She had thrown flares at human beings and watched one of them fall to his death. Her hands were covered in blood, some of it hers and some of it from the rocks where the attackers had taken cover. When Marcus reached her position, the first thing he did was check her for serious injuries. His touch was gentle but professional, and Sarah realized he had medical training beyond basic field care. The cut on her forehead looked worse than it was, but she also had several smaller cuts from flying rock fragments and a deep bruise on her shoulder, where she had slammed against the boulder during the firefight. "You saved my life," Marcus said quietly as he used his field medical kit to clean the worst of her wounds. "What you did was incredibly brave and incredibly stupid." Sarah finally found her voice. "Are they all dead?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, and in about 10 minutes. This place is going to be crawling with my team and half the Coast Guard. We need to get you medical attention and then figure out how to explain what happened here." As if summoned by his words, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of helicopters approaching from the direction of the ocean. Marcus helped her stand, and together they watched as 2 Coast Guard helicopters and what looked like a military transport aircraft approached Eagle Point. "Your 20 minutes are up," Sarah said, trying to smile despite the pain and shock. Marcus looked at her with something that might have been admiration or might have been concern. "Sarah, when my team gets here, they're going to want to know everything that happened. Are you ready for that conversation?" She nodded, though she wasn't sure she was ready for anything that came next. All she knew was that a quiet Tuesday evening walk had turned into something that would change her life forever. And the man standing beside her was someone she was probably going to know for a very long time. The first helicopter touched down on the flat area near the lighthouse, sending sand and debris flying in all directions. Sarah watched through eyes that felt heavy and unfocused as 6 men in military gear jumped out and immediately secured the landing zone. Their movements were precise and coordinated, like a machine designed for exactly this type of situation. Marcus helped Sarah down the cliff trail, supporting most of her weight as her legs continued to shake from the adrenaline crash. The cut on her forehead had stopped bleeding, but she felt dizzy and disoriented. Every few steps she had to stop and remind herself that the fighting was over, that she was safe. "Easy," Marcus said when she stumbled on a loose rock. "We're almost down. Just keep breathing." The team leader approached them as they reached the bottom of the trail. He was a tall man with gray hair and the kind of weathered face that comes from years of dangerous work. His eyes quickly assessed both Marcus's shoulder wound and Sarah's condition, before focusing on the 3 bodies scattered around the cove. "Petty Officer Chen," the team leader said. "Report. Sir, 3 hostiles attempted to establish a beachhead at this location. Civilian Sarah Martinez provided crucial assistance during the engagement. She requires medical attention for multiple lacerations and possible shock. The team leader looked at Sarah with new interest. Ma'am, I'm Commander James Rodriguez. Can you tell me what happened here? Sarah tried to speak, but her mouth felt dry and her thoughts seemed scattered. The events of the last hour felt like they had happened to someone else, like a movie she had watched instead of something she had lived through. Commander, Marcus interrupted. She needs a medic first. Debriefing can wait. Rodriguez nodded and called over one of his men, a young medic named Stevens, who immediately began examining Sarah's injuries. His hands were gentle but thorough as he checked her pupils, took her pulse, and cleaned the cuts on her face and arms. Mild concussion, multiple lacerations, probable shock, Stevens reported. She needs IV fluids and observation, but nothing life-threatening. As the medic worked, Sarah watched the rest of the team examine the cove with the efficiency of crime scene investigators. They photographed everything, collected weapons and equipment, and documented the positions where each body had fallen. Their movements were so professional that she began to understand this wasn't just a routine military operation. What were they doing here? Sarah asked Marcus, who was receiving his own medical treatment from another team member. We're not entirely sure yet, Marcus replied, wincing as the medic cleaned his shoulder wound. But they weren't tourists and they weren't here by accident. Commander Rodriguez overheard the conversation and approached them. Ms. Martinez, I know you've been through a traumatic experience, but I need to ask you some questions. The information you provide could be crucial to our investigation. Sarah nodded, though she still felt like her brain was working through thick fog. I'll tell you what I can remember. Start from the beginning. What brought you to this location tonight? Sarah described her usual evening walk, discovering the boat and meeting Marcus on the trail. As she talked, her memories became clearer, and the details of the fight came back with uncomfortable precision. She could remember the exact sound the first attacker had made when the flare hit him, the way the rocks had exploded when bullets struck them, the weight of the stones she had thrown. You had no military training? Rodriguez asked. No, sir. I'm a nurse. I couldn't leave him there alone. Rodriguez exchanged a look with Marcus that Sarah couldn't interpret. Ms. Martinez, what you did tonight prevented a potentially serious security breach. These men were part of a larger organization that has been trying to establish operational bases along this coastline. Your actions may have saved many lives. The words didn't make Sarah feel better. She kept thinking about the man who had fallen from the cliff, wondering if he had family somewhere who would never know what happened to him. The rational part of her mind understood that she had defended herself and Marcus, but the emotional part struggled with the reality of what she had done. I need to call my supervisor, Sarah said suddenly. Dr. Williams will be wondering why I'm not at work tomorrow. Ma'am, Stevens the medic said gently. It's after midnight. You've been here for several hours. Sarah looked around in surprise. The cove was now brightly lit with portable floodlights, and she could see teams of investigators working throughout the area. Coast Guard boats surrounded the small bay, and more helicopters had arrived while she was being treated. The entire operation had a scope and scale that made her realize she had stumbled into something much larger than a simple criminal activity. This isn't just about tonight, is it? She asked Commander Rodriguez. No, ma'am. This investigation has been ongoing for several months. We've been tracking this organization as they attempted to establish supply routes and safe houses along the eastern seaboard. Tonight was supposed to be our opportunity to observe their operations and identify their leadership. Marcus looked up from where another medic was bandaging his shoulder. Instead, they accelerated their timeline and forced a confrontation. Because I was there, Sarah said, understanding flooding through her. If I hadn't been walking on that trail, you could have watched them without being detected. Ms. Martinez, Rodriguez said firmly, what happened tonight was not your fault. These individuals were armed and dangerous. If they had succeeded in establishing their position here, the consequences could have been severe. Your actions prevented that from happening. A new helicopter approached from the direction of town, and Sarah could see the distinctive markings of a medical evacuation aircraft. She realized they were planning to transport her to a hospital, probably for a more thorough examination and treatment. I don't need to go to a hospital, she protested. I work at the medical clinic in town. Dr. Williams can take care of anything I need. Ma'am, Stevens said, you've been exposed to combat stress and sustained multiple injuries. Hospital protocol requires observation for at least 24 hours. Sarah looked at Marcus, hoping he would support her preference to stay local, but his expression was serious. Sarah, they're right. You need proper medical care, and you need time to process what happened tonight. This isn't something you just walk away from. The medical helicopter landed and 2 paramedics approached with a stretcher. Sarah realized that her quiet life in Millfield was about to become much more complicated. The story of what had happened at Eagle Point would spread through the small town within hours, and she would become the center of attention in ways she had never wanted. "Will I see you again?" she asked Marcus as the paramedics prepared to move her to the helicopter. Marcus exchanged another look with Commander Rodriguez before answering. "Sarah, after tonight our lives are connected in ways that go beyond what happened in this cove. My team and I owe you a debt that we can never fully repay. Yes, you'll see me again." As the helicopter lifted off, Sarah looked down at Eagle Point one last time. The cove was still brightly lit with dozens of people working to process the scene. From the air it looked like a small city had appeared on the coastline, all because of her decision to turn around and help a stranger. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine returning to her normal routine of morning coffee at Murphy's Diner and afternoon repairs on her cottage. Somehow she knew that life was over, and whatever came next would be entirely different from the quiet existence she had sought in Millfield. The debriefing room at the Naval Intelligence Facility was sterile and windowless, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that made everyone look tired. Commander Rodriguez sat at the head of a long conference table, surrounded by 6 members of Marcus's Special Operations team. They had been awake for 36 hours straight, but none of them showed any signs of fatigue as they reviewed what had happened at Eagle Point. "Play it again," Rodriguez said to the technician operating the projection system. The wall screen flickered to life, showing drone footage of the cove from the previous night. The team watched in silence as the events unfolded from an aerial perspective, seeing the gunfight play out like pieces on a chessboard. The footage clearly showed Sarah's position on the cliff, her movements as she threw rocks and fired flares, and the precise moment when her actions allowed Marcus to turn the tide of the battle. "Freeze it there," Rodriguez said, when the image showed Sarah helping the injured attacker fall from the cliff face. "Petty Officer Chen, walk us through her mindset at this moment." Marcus stood and moved to the screen, pointing at Sarah's position. "Sir, she had fired her last flare. 2 hostiles were closing on her position from different angles. She had no weapons, no escape route, and no military training. Any rational person would have surrendered or tried to flee. But she didn't," said Petty Officer Williams, the team's demolitions expert. "No," Marcus replied. "She held her position and continued to create distractions until I could neutralize the remaining threats. Her actions were tactically sound and personally suicidal." The room fell quiet as the team absorbed the implications of what they were seeing. These men had worked together for years, facing danger in locations around the world, but they rarely encountered civilians willing to risk their lives for strangers. "What do we know about her background?" asked Chief Petty Officer Thompson, the team's senior enlisted advisor. Rodriguez opened a file folder and spread several documents across the table. Sarah Martinez, age 32, former emergency room nurse from Boston General Hospital. Exemplary record, multiple commendations for performance under pressure. Left her position 6 months ago and moved to Millfield. No family, few close friends, clean financial and legal record. "Why did she leave Boston?" Williams asked. Medical administrator cited burnout and requested extended leave. Hospital records show she was involved in several high-profile trauma cases that resulted in patient deaths. Appears to have been suffering from cumulative stress associated with emergency medicine. Marcus studied Sarah's photograph in the file. It showed a professional headshot from her hospital ID. But even in the formal image, he could see the same determination in her eyes that he had witnessed during the firefight. She came to Millfield to escape from situations exactly like what happened last night, he said quietly. And instead, she ran toward the danger when it would have been easier to run away, Thompson observed. Rodriguez closed the file and looked around the table. "Gentlemen, we have a problem. Ms. Martinez is now a material witness in a classified operation. She has seen and done things that compromise the security of our investigation. Standard protocol would require us to relocate her and place her in a witness protection program." "Sir," Marcus interrupted, "with respect, that woman saved my life and prevented a significant security breach. She deserves better than having her life turned upside down because she did the right thing." What are you suggesting, Petty Officer Chen? Marcus had been thinking about this question since the helicopter had carried Sarah away from Eagle Point. He knew that his team had resources and capabilities that went far beyond standard military operations, and he believed they had an obligation to use those resources to help the woman who had risked everything for a stranger. Sir, I'm suggesting that we take care of her the way she took care of us. She needs protection, but she also needs to maintain some semblance of a normal life. We have the capability to provide both. Rodriguez studied Marcus for a long moment. Are you talking about an unofficial protection detail? I'm talking about making sure that Sarah Martinez can continue living in Millfield without constantly looking over her shoulder. The organization we disrupted last night had operations in 12 states. They're going to want to know who compromised their mission, and they're going to have questions about what happened to their people. Williams leaned forward in his chair. Chen's right, sir. We've been tracking this group for 8 months. They don't forget and they don't forgive. If they identify her as the person responsible for stopping their operation, she becomes a target. And if they target her, they target the town, Thompson added. Millfield has a population of 800 people. These aren't the kind of opponents who worry about collateral damage. Rodriguez was quiet for several minutes, weighing the official requirements of his mission against the unofficial obligations his team felt toward Sarah. Finally, he turned to the technician running the projection system. Clear the room, he ordered. I need to speak with my team privately. When they were alone, Rodriguez's demeanor changed from formal military bearing to something more personal. These men had served together through missions that would never appear in any official records, and they had developed the kind of trust that comes only from shared danger. Off the record, Rodriguez said, what are you proposing? Marcus had expected this question and had spent hours developing his answer. Sir, we establish a rotating presence in Millfield. Nothing obvious, nothing that would attract attention. We take turns spending time in the area, getting to know the community, making sure Sarah is safe without making her feel like a prisoner. That could take months, Williams pointed out. This group has resources and patience. They might wait a year before making their move. Then we wait a year, Marcus replied without hesitation. Sir, I watched this woman risk her life for someone she had never met, using weapons she had never fired, in a situation she never should have been in. If we don't protect her now, we're no better than the people we're fighting against. Thompson nodded in agreement. The lady has earned our respect and our protection. I volunteer for the first rotation. Count me in, Williams said immediately. One by one, each member of the team volunteered for what they knew would be an extended, unofficial mission with no recognition and no official support. Rodriguez realized he was looking at men who had found something worth protecting beyond their normal duties. This conversation never happened, Rodriguez said finally. Officially, the investigation into the Eagle Point incident is closed. Unofficially, you men are taking accumulated leave time in a scenic coastal town where you can rest and recover from recent operations. Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he was carrying. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. Chen, if this goes wrong, if your presence in Millfield is discovered or if Ms. Martinez is harmed despite your efforts, it becomes a major diplomatic and security incident. You'll be protecting not just her, but the integrity of operations that affect national security. Understood, sir. Rodriguez gathered the files and photographs from the table. One more thing, gentlemen. Ms. Martinez doesn't know about this decision yet. She's been released from the hospital and returned to her home in Millfield. Someone needs to have a conversation with her about what happens next. Marcus stood up from the table. Sir, I'd like to be the one to talk with her. I thought you might, Rodriguez replied with something that might have been a smile. Petty Officer Chen, you leave for Millfield in 6 hours. Try not to get yourself shot this time. As the team filed out of the debriefing room, Marcus realized he was both nervous and excited about seeing Sarah again. He had been thinking about her constantly since Eagle Point, wondering how she was processing what had happened, whether she was sleeping, whether she understood how much her actions had meant to him and his team. In 6 hours, he would find out if the woman who had saved his life was ready to let him and his team spend the next several months returning the favor. Sarah was attempting to fix her front steps when she heard the motorcycle approaching. The sound of the engine was different from the usual traffic in Millfield, more powerful and precise, like the difference between a scalpel and a butter knife. She looked up from her work to see a black Honda pulling into her driveway, ridden by someone in jeans and a leather jacket. When the rider removed his helmet, Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Marcus Chen looked different in civilian clothes, younger and less intimidating than he had appeared in their previous encounters. His left arm was still in a sling from the shoulder wound, but he moved with the same controlled awareness she remembered from Eagle Point. "You shouldn't be lifting heavy things," he said, nodding toward the wooden planks she had been trying to maneuver into place. "The steps have been dangerous for months," Sarah replied, setting down her hammer. "If I don't fix them, someone's going to get hurt." Marcus smiled at that, and Sarah realized he found something amusing about her concern for other people's safety, given what had happened 3 days ago. She felt suddenly self-conscious about her appearance, wearing old jeans and a paint-stained sweatshirt with sawdust in her hair. "How are you feeling?" Marcus asked, his tone becoming more serious. "Like I was hit by a truck, shot at by terrorists, and then spent 24 hours in a hospital being asked the same questions over and over again by people who wouldn't tell me what was really going on." "That's fair," Marcus said. "Can we talk? There are some things you need to know about what happens next." Sarah invited him inside, apologizing for the chaos of ongoing renovations. The living room was half-painted, with furniture covered in plastic sheeting and tools scattered across every available surface. Marcus looked around with interest, and Sarah noticed he automatically positioned himself where he could see both the front door and the back entrance. "You're still on duty, aren't you?" she asked as she poured coffee from the pot she always kept ready. "In a sense, Sarah. The people you helped us stop at Eagle Point were part of a larger organization. They had operations planned along the entire eastern seaboard, and what you did disrupted months of planning and intelligence gathering." Sarah set down her coffee cup carefully. "You're telling me this because they're going to be angry about what happened?" "Yes. And because they're going to want to know who was responsible for stopping them." The implication of his words settled over Sarah like a cold blanket. She had been trying to return to her normal routine, but deep down she had known that what happened at Eagle Point would have consequences beyond the immediate aftermath. "So what does that mean for me?" she asked. Marcus leaned forward in his chair, and Sarah could see the weight of responsibility in his expression. "It means that my team and I are going to be spending time in Millfield for the foreseeable future. Unofficially, we're taking some well-deserved leave in a beautiful coastal town. Officially, we're making sure that you stay safe." "You mean like bodyguards?" "More like friends who happen to have military training and a strong interest in your continued good health." Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street where Mrs. Patterson was tending her garden, and Pete the handyman was fixing someone's mailbox. The normalcy of the scene felt fragile, like something that could be shattered by the wrong word or unexpected visitor. "How long?" she asked. "However long it takes. These people are patient and well-funded. They might move against you next week, or they might wait 6 months. We don't know their timeline, but we know they don't forget." Sarah turned back to face Marcus. "And you're willing to put your lives on hold to protect someone you barely know?" "Sarah, what you did at Eagle Point saved my life and prevented what could have been a significant terrorist operation on American soil. My team and I consider that a debt we need to repay. I didn't do it expecting payment. I did it because it was the right thing to do." "I know," Marcus said quietly. "That's exactly why we're here." Before Sarah could respond, she heard another motorcycle approaching, followed by the sound of a pickup truck. Through the window, she watched 2 more men arrive, each moving with the same controlled awareness that Marcus displayed. They parked across the street and began what looked like casual conversations with Mrs. Patterson and Pete. "Your team?" Sarah asked. Marcus nodded. "Thompson and Williams. They're getting to know the neighborhood, establishing what we call a presence without being obvious about it." Sarah watched as Thompson, a man in his 40s with graying hair, admired Mrs. Patterson's roses while keeping a subtle eye on the approaches to Sarah's house. Williams, younger and wearing the clothes of someone who might work construction, was examining Pete's toolbox and asking questions about local repair jobs. "They're going to pretend to live here?" "Not pretend. We've rented houses in town, and we're going to become part of the community. Thompson is thinking about opening a small security consulting business. Williams has a background in construction and electronics, so he'll probably find work helping people with renovations and repairs." "And you?" Marcus smiled, and Sarah noticed that his whole face changed when he wasn't being professionally serious. "I'm still figuring that out. I have some savings, and I've always been interested in small-town life." Maybe I'll find something that needs doing around here. Sarah looked at her broken front steps, her half-painted living room, and the list of repairs that seemed to grow longer every day. I might know someone who could use help with a renovation project. Is that an offer? It's a practical solution. If you're going to be watching out for me anyway, you might as well be useful while you're doing it. Marcus laughed, and the sound was warm and genuine. I should warn you. My experience is mostly with tactical equipment and military vehicles. I've never painted a living room or fixed porch. Steps. Then it's time you learned some new skills. They spent the next hour walking through Sarah's house while she explained her renovation plans, and Marcus asked surprisingly thoughtful questions about the work involved. He seemed genuinely interested in the project, and Sarah found herself relaxing in his company despite the circumstances that had brought him to her door. When Thompson and Williams finally approached the house, they had somehow acquired an invitation to dinner from Mrs. Patterson and a potential job offer from Pete. Sarah realized she was looking at men who were professionally skilled at becoming part of whatever environment they found themselves in. "Ma'am," Thompson said as Marcus introduced them, "we want you to know that we consider it an honor to be here. What you did for Marcus, you did for all of us." Williams nodded in agreement. "We know this isn't the quiet life you came to Millfield to find, but we're going to do everything we can to make sure you can have that life, eventually." Sarah looked at the three men standing in her unfinished living room and realized that her world had changed in ways she was still trying to understand. 3 days ago, she had been a woman running away from her past, trying to find peace in a small town where nothing exciting ever happened. Now she was the center of a protection operation involving trained special forces operators who were willing to put their lives on hold to keep her safe. "There's something I need to ask," Sarah said. "Are you doing this because it's your job or because you want to?" The three men exchanged looks, and Sarah could see years of shared experience in their silent communication. "Sarah," Marcus said finally, "we do a lot of things because they're our job. This isn't one of them. This is personal." Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness or fear. For the first time since Eagle Point, she felt like she wasn't facing the future alone. She had found herself in the middle of something dangerous and complicated, but she had also found people who were willing to stand with her regardless of the cost. "In that case," she said, wiping her eyes and picking up her hammer, "we have some steps to fix before someone gets hurt." 3 months later, Sarah was beginning to understand what normal felt like again. She woke up to the sound of hammering from next door, where Williams was helping Mrs. Patterson build a new greenhouse for her prized orchids. Thompson's security consulting business had become surprisingly popular with local businesses, and he had established himself as the person to call when anyone in town had concerns about safety or security. Marcus had become her business partner in what they jokingly called Chen Martinez Home renovations. His lack of experience with civilian construction had been more than offset by his precision, attention to detail, and ability to solve problems under pressure. Sarah's cottage had been transformed from a charming disaster into something that belonged in a home improvement magazine. More importantly, the three men had become part of Millfield in ways that felt natural and unforced. Thompson coached the local high school baseball team in his spare time. Williams had started dating the librarian, much to the delight of the town's unofficial matchmaking committee. Marcus had been elected to the town council after proposing a comprehensive emergency preparedness plan that impressed everyone except Sarah, who knew exactly why he understood emergency planning so well. The threat they had been protecting against had never materialized in the dramatic way everyone had expected. Instead, there had been a series of small incidents that might have seemed unrelated to anyone who wasn't watching carefully. A rental car with out-of-state plates that circled the town several times before leaving. Strangers asking questions about Sarah at Murphy's Diner. A break-in at the medical clinic. That had appeared to be random. Vandalism, but had targeted only Sarah's employment. Records, each incident had been handled quietly and efficiently by Marcus and his team, often before Sarah even knew something had happened. She had gradually learned to read the subtle changes in their behavior that indicated when they were responding to a potential threat, and she had come to trust their judgment about what she needed to know versus what they could handle without involving her. On a Tuesday evening in late fall, Sarah was working late at the clinic when Marcus appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and an expression she had learned to recognize as important news. "We need to talk," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Good news or bad news?" "Good news, mostly. The organization we've been watching for has been dismantled. Federal agents arrested the leadership in coordinated raids across 6 states this morning. The threat to you and to this town is over." Sarah set down her pen and tried to process what he was telling her. For 3 months, she had lived with the knowledge that dangerous people might be looking for her, but she had become so accustomed to the protection Marcus and his team provided that the threat had become abstract, like worrying about earthquakes in an area where they rarely happen. "That's wonderful news," she said carefully. "So what happens now?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah realized he was choosing his words carefully. "Officially, our mission here is complete. We're free to return to our regular duties. And unofficially? Unofficially, we've all discovered that we like small-town life more than we expected. Thompson's security business is actually profitable. Williams is talking about proposing to Janet, and I think she's going to say yes. And I've been offered a position as Millfield's first official emergency management coordinator." Sarah felt a complex mixture of relief and anticipation. The immediate danger was over, but the future was still uncertain in ways that had nothing to do with external threats and everything to do with the relationships that had developed over the past 3 months. "And what did you tell them about the emergency management position?" "I told them I needed to discuss it with my business partner first." Sarah smiled at that. Their renovation partnership had evolved into something that felt more significant than a business arrangement, though neither of them had been willing to define exactly what it was becoming. "Your business partner thinks that Millfield would be lucky to have you in any official capacity," she said. "But she also thinks you should make that decision based on what you want, not what you think you owe her." Marcus leaned back in his chair and studied her face. "Sarah, what I want is to stay in this town, to keep working with you on projects that matter and to see what develops between us when we're not constantly worried about external threats. What I owe you has nothing to do with those feelings. Are you sure about that? Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between gratitude and genuine affection when they develop under extreme circumstances." "I've been thinking about that question for 3 months," Marcus replied. "And I've concluded that it doesn't matter how our relationship started. What matters is how we choose to continue it." Before Sarah could respond, they heard voices from the clinic's waiting room. Marcus immediately shifted into alert mode, positioning himself between Sarah and the door while reaching for the communication device that kept him in contact with Thompson and Williams. "Expecting anyone?" he asked quietly. Sarah checked her appointment book. "The clinic is supposed to be closed. Everyone should have gone home hours ago." Marcus spoke briefly into his radio, then listened to a response that made him relax visibly. "It's Thompson and Williams. They want to talk with both of us." The 2 men entered the office with expressions that Sarah had learned to associate with completed missions and good outcomes. Thompson was carrying a bottle of champagne, and Williams had what appeared to be official documents. "Congratulations," Thompson said, setting the champagne on Sarah's desk. "The last of the organization's leadership was arrested about an hour ago. The FBI wanted us to deliver the official notification that your protected status has been lifted." Williams handed Marcus and Sarah each a folder containing official letters from various federal agencies, all saying essentially the same thing in bureaucratic language. The threat was over, their cooperation had been valuable, and their discretion regarding classified aspects of the operation was still required. "There's one more thing," Williams said, pulling out a smaller envelope addressed to Sarah. "This is from Commander Rodriguez." Sarah opened the envelope and found a handwritten letter on official Navy letterhead. Rodriguez had written to thank her personally for her actions at Eagle Point, and to inform her that her bravery had been noted in classified records that would someday, when the full story could be told, reflect the crucial role she had played in protecting national security. "He also wanted you to know," Thompson added, "that if you ever decide you want a career in federal law enforcement or intelligence work, you have people who would provide the strongest possible recommendations." Sarah looked around at the 3 men who had become such an important part of her life and realized that she was facing the same type of decision she had faced 3 months ago, though in completely different circumstances. Then she had chosen to help a stranger because it was the right thing to do. Now she needed to choose what kind of future she wanted to build with the people who had become much more than protectors. "I appreciate the offer," she said finally, "but I think I've found the career I want right here in Millfield. Working with people who understand the importance of protecting the things that matter." Marcus smiled and reached for the champagne bottle. "In that case, I think we should celebrate the end of one mission and the beginning of whatever comes next." As Thompson opened the champagne and Williams proposed a toast to successful missions and new beginnings, Sarah realized that her quiet life in Millfield had become something entirely different from what she had originally sought. She had come to this town looking for peace and anonymity, but instead she had found purpose, community, and relationships that she valued more than the safety she had originally craved. 6 months ago, she had been running away from a life that felt too dangerous and demanding. Tonight she was choosing to embrace a future that would certainly be challenging, but would also be shared with people who had proven they could be trusted with her life, her safety, and her heart. The woman who had bled protecting a Navy SEAL had discovered that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against external enemies, but for the chance to build something worth protecting. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the people you save end up saving you in return.